It's day 201. It's also November 23rd, 2019. And we're in Scottsdale, Arizona. You ever wake up in the morning and ask yourself, what am I doing? And more importantly, why? Yeah, me too. Hi, my name's Craig, and this is my story. A story about life. Life out there. For visuals while listening, search Life Out There on your favorite social media platform or use the links in the podcast description. Pulling back out onto the carefree highway and heading towards Scottsdale, the chunks of mud flying off the wheels of Vacilando made it clear that our first stop would need to be a car wash. One big enough for Vacilando. A quick Google search would tell us that the nearest car wash, with RV bays, was just 30 miles up the road, in Scottsdale. Well, that's convenient. We'd spend over an hour at that car wash and spend $20 in quarters. It's amazing the places you can find mud underneath an RV and that car we're towing after a couple of nights in the rainy deserts of Arizona. From the car wash, we'd head to our home for the next few nights, and RV spotted a place called Westworld. And this Westworld place? Pretty dang cool, and pretty impressive. Once we were all checked in, and the camp was set up, awnings out and the rugs thrown down, we were ready to check this place out. And the first thing we'd notice, the entire massive RV parking area is entirely asphalt. This is the first place we'd stayed since Las Vegas in which everything was concrete. Only this place was way bigger. Now granted, we'd only stayed in 3 RV parks in 3 of the 5 states we visited so far, so not much to compare it to. I guess we really are boondockers at heart. But nonetheless, the RV setup here is pretty unique. And it doesn't take much walking around to begin to get a sense for how huge this place is. In fact, quoting the internet, Westworld of Scottsdale is a premier multi-use events facility. It spans 386 acres at the base of the McDowell Mountains and is known for hosting a wide variety of events throughout the year, close quote. And by variety of events, I think they also mean a lot of events. Over 100 separate events each year. At any given time, you can find yourself attending horse shows and rodeos, or even a polo match or two. In fact, Westworld is host to the annual Bentley Scottsdale Polo Championships, which is also known as America's greatest polo party. This event typically features 4 to 5 polo matches in a single day, and in addition to the fun on the polo fields, the event also draws large crowds to other events included in the world's greatest polo party, including fashion shows, car displays, and lots of good food. And I'm guessing even better live music. But the festivities here at Westworld are not limited to those done on horseback. Each year, the Barrett-Jackson Auto Auction also calls Westworld home for a few days. Barrett-Jackson calls the event the Mecca of classic car auctions, and the place where car lovers congregate from around the world to find the car of their dreams, or simply maybe just stare at the past, the present, and the future of the automobile, one of the single most influential inventions in the history of man. And Barrett-Jackson, perhaps better than any other, has taken their events to the next level. It's fascinating to read that a couple of guys trying to sell a Cadillac in the late 60s would come together and dream up what initially was planned to be a one-time event right here in Scottsdale, but would go on to become the premier event it is today, nearly 60 years later. Now for sure, the event in Scottsdale is held each year to offer up dreams for auction. And just this year, nearly $1.5 million was spent on one of those dreams here in Scottsdale, a brand new McLaren Senna, one of only 120 that'll make their way to the U.S. this year. And if some dreamer was willing to fork over that much dough here in Scottsdale, I had to know what the world record was. And that record was set just last year, in 2018. It wasn't in Scottsdale, but still in the U.S. The Sotheby's auction in New York would find itself home to this record-setting event when a 1962 Ferrari 350 GTO would fetch $48.4 million. Wow. Seems a guy's dreams can get pretty spendy if they revolve around a classic car. But Barrett-Jackson events aren't just about the auction itself. It's also about charity and community. Barrett-Jackson auctions across the country have raised millions for local charities, hoping to help make a different sort of dream come true. And Scottsdale may be their flagship event each year, drawing some 200,000 automotive enthusiasts. But Barrett-Jackson didn't stop here. They now organize events across the country. You can catch one in Palm Beach, Florida, Las Vegas, Nevada, or Houston, Texas. The bottom line here is that Barrett-Jackson has evolved into a cultural icon, becoming synonymous with high-end collector car auctions, setting numerous records for vehicle sales, attracting celebrities and automotive legends, all the while working to bring some good to the communities they call home. And Scottsdale, that's where it all began. And back to this place called Westworld? Well, each morning, as Dougie and I walked around the place, fully aware that we were only seeing a small part of this nearly 400-acre facility, we'd walk by janitorial staffs cleaning up the restroom and laundry facilities at the start of each day, and walk by teams tearing down a venue from yesterday's event and beginning setting up for the next. And all the while, thinking about the over 100 events we had read would take place here each year, wondering what the next event would be. Another rodeo? That National Quarter Horse Reining event each year? The Scottsdale 4th of July celebration, or the next classic car show, or when the next International Off-Road and UTV Expo might be held. Each time we returned to our little piece of asphalt and chatting with the neighbors about how empty the RV parking area looked, oftentimes guessing what event might come close to filling all 450 RV spaces. The consensus on the internet and amongst my very few neighbors, was that it would most likely be that Barrett-Jackson event, held each year in January, and drawing those 200,000 people, probably many of which arrived in RVs with their spaces reserved. Further consensus amongst us November visitors is that we preferred our surroundings just the way they are. Can't even imagine, wouldn't want to imagine, what it might be like being the 450th RV to pull in here next January. Our first evening in Scottsdale would be spent with friends and family. And I gotta say, the folks here in the Indian Hills area of Scottsdale, they got things pretty figured out. It takes a little more than lounging alongside an infinity pool, visiting with family, and staring off into those mountains, while one pizza comes out of the pizza oven and another goes in, to appreciate just what folks have come to love here in this part of Arizona's Sonoran Desert. Flip side, it was pointed out to me on several occasions that this patio and that infinity pool are a much different experience in July when it's 114 degrees in the shade. So yeah, there's that. And note to self, visit Arizona in November. And we had a pretty awesome Thanksgiving here in Scottsdale. The days spent exploring, learning, and spending time with friends and family. The early mornings and evenings spent digging into more of the history of this place called Scottsdale. But while reading, I'd realized that for everything I'd learned about this desert, I hadn't yet read about how it came to be in the first place. I'd done all that reading about how the Pacific Northwest had transformed from a massive sheet of ice over millions of years into the mountainous wooded regions we see today, and how those massive rock cliffs and oil-rich mountains of Wyoming and Colorado had come to be. But what happened here, just 1,000 or so miles away? What made this place so very different from those? And just like most every part of the country we've seen so far, this Sonoran Desert has been a very different place, beginning and throughout the 8 million or so years it's taken to get to what we look at today. Here in the desert that we see today, it's hard to imagine it ever having a tropical climate. But millions of years ago, it did. The very same tectonic activity that ultimately shaped much of the landscape across the western portion of the United States would eventually begin to take the desert southwest in a bit of a different direction. Those drifting continents over millions of years that would begin to push huge mountain ranges up from the Earth's crust up north would begin to become much more isolated down here. And those isolated mountain ranges would be surrounded by expansive areas of flat and valleys. Through this period, and as global climate patterns began to shift, the desert southwest would begin to experience the rain shadow effects from those isolated mountain ranges. The rain shadow effect, well, as I understand it, is that essentially those isolated mountain ranges block the moist air from coming off the Pacific coast. As the air moves in and is forced up over the mountains, it's cooled, and in doing so, a much drier air reaches the desert floor on the other side, creating a much more arid environment, and over time, also driving temperatures up. Now, this process would take millions of years of shifting climates along with those geographical shifts to culminate in what we experience today. But I was curious to know how a monsoon season could happen in an area that is typically blocked or shielded from the rainy seasons experienced along the West Coast. Well, the explanation, it seems, is pretty simple. As seasonal climate shifts to what the West Coast calls winter and spring, the rains begin to come from the south, the Gulf of California, and the Gulf of Mexico, and the hot, arid temperatures of the desert valleys begin to function almost like a vacuum, drawing that wet air up through and into areas that are not shielded by isolated mountain ranges. Now, all this is pretty complex for sure. I just had to simplify to make it make sense in this simpleton's brain. But just as I'd stared at those Precambrian rock mountains in Wyoming, the high desert regions of Colorado, and even the Puget Sound region of Washington, it's fun to stare at the wide-open Sonoran Desert and wonder how all that happened, and picturing how over millions of years, the planet basically shape-shifted and rearranged entire continents as if putting together a jigsaw puzzle. It's all fascinating. And just as fascinating is learning how the ecosystems in each of those areas evolved over time, bringing to each species of plants and animals that can only live exactly where they live. It's like it was planned. Thinking about how the universe has carefully worked all this out over those millions of years, and standing here on the desert floor thinking about how it was once covered by a massive inland sea that covered so much of the U.S., but how time would fill those inland seas to become this desert floor. And then, how man, in just some 300 or 400 years, has transformed the human race from one of regionalized civilizations existing in a world in which the only forms of transportation were our own 2 legs, then horses and ships, to the one we live in today, in which we traverse the globe in a matter of hours in a 900,000-pound piece of metal that catapults us through the air at 600 or 700 miles an hour, not to mention some 30,000 feet above these deserts I'm looking at. It's all pretty awesome. And then there's this place called Scottsdale. What makes it different? How did Scottsdale happen? Well, not a lot of surprises in the first few thousand years anyway. The area would be a part of the Hohokam civilization I had just learned about a few miles back. Those folks that called the desert region home for a couple of thousand years before somewhat mysteriously disappearing from the landscape. But their departure did not mark the end of Native American presence. In the following years, the Pima and the Maricopa tribes would settle in the region and call it home. Until those pesky explorers from Spain, then Mexico showed up. And, as is the case here, as well as across the rest of what would become the United States, it would be the newly titled American settler that would move into the region and begin calling it their own. Well, after a Mexican-American War, the Apache Wars, and, countless skirmishes across the region between Native Americans and U.S. settlers. So, in other words, a lot of fighting and winning. It would be near the end of all this hubbub when a U.S. Army chaplain by the name of Winfield Scott would arrive in the area just outside Phoenix in 1888. He would purchase 640 acres in what would later become the heart of present-day Scottsdale. The town itself was initially called Orangedale. But when a newspaper article mistakenly referred to the town as Scottsdale, after the Army chaplain, the name apparently stuck. Just another example of how a wacky turn of events ended up naming a town. The area would remain a quiet place, primarily engaged in agricultural activity until the turn of the 20th century, when in 1908, the Granite Reef Dam would begin construction. And just a few years later, in 1911, the Roosevelt Dam would follow, both dams constructed on the Salt River. These dams would provide a reliable water supply to the area and would begin the growth era for not only Phoenix, but Scottsdale and many of the surrounding communities as well. Scottsdale would not incorporate until 1951 and did so with a population of a mere 2,000 residents. And it seems as though it would be around this time that Scottsdale would begin setting itself apart from the surrounding communities. Well before incorporation even, early settlers in the area, many of whom were well-educated and culturally inclined, established the Scottsdale public school system way back in 1896. In a time when Arizona was still a territory, folks across the region understood the importance of education. The folks in Tucson led the charge, establishing their educational system in 1868. Phoenix would follow suit in 1871, and Scottsdale, a much younger community, understood the importance as well, which is why their system was established shortly after their arrival in the area. The residents of early Scottsdale would even support a burgeoning art scene on top of their passion for education. Those early investments in both education and art would go on to play major roles in the development of the area. The community would continue its forward thinking when in 1909 they would begin constructing exclusive resort communities, with the first being the Ingleside Inn. The Jacaki Resort would be added to the list of exclusive resort properties in 1922, and this thinking and strategy nearly immediately began to set Scottsdale apart, driving tourism amongst the affluent in the area, in a time when many areas barely even knew what tourism was, let alone consider investing in it. It would be strategies like these, and the natural draw of the Sonoran Desert, that would bring the world-renowned architect Frank Lloyd Wright to the area in 1937. Wright would design and add his Talesian West to the Scottsdale landscape. He initially built the one-of-a-kind complex as his winter home and studio, but it would go on to become the world headquarters for both the Talesian Fellowship and the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. And just this year, it was named a World Heritage Site. Being named a World Heritage Site means that a place, such as an area, a building, or a city, has been recognized by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization for its outstanding universal value to humanity. And all of this would come together to establish Scottsdale as an educational and a cultural hub in the region, and over time, across the country. Forward thinking had brought this tightly knit community to exactly where it needed to be when World War II would have its impact on the town, just as it did the entire nation. World War II would come to Scottsdale in the form of the Thunderbird II airfield, established on June 22, 1942. It was installed as a basic training facility for the Army Air Corps pilots, and the airfield was part of a broader effort to rapidly expand the U.S. military's capabilities during the war. Over 5,500 pilots would undergo rigorous training here in Scottsdale, making them combat ready. The airfield was deactivated in October of 1944 and would begin an interesting transition. Near the end of the war, the field would be acquired by the Arizona State Teachers College for an aviation program. The Teachers College would later be renamed Arizona State University. And in 1953, the Arizona Conference of Seventh-day Adventists would acquire the property and establish the Thunderbird Adventist Academy. The former military barracks were converted into dormitories, and the hangars were adapted for vocational training in mechanics, woodworking, and welding. The academy would continue to expand over the years, adding to the facility to accommodate the growth in student population. And it continues its educational mission to this day. But in 1966, the Arizona Conference of Seventh-day Adventists sold the airfield portion of the facility to the city of Scottsdale. The town of 2000 had grown into a city of just over 10,000, and those forward thinkers in Scottsdale had decided it was time for them to have an airport of their own. And the city didn't waste any time. By 1967, they had secured their first fixed-based operator and began operation as a general aviation airport. And today, Scottsdale and its population of nearly 250,000 have at their disposal a full-range aviation hub that handles some 130,000 takeoffs and landings each year. That's over 360 every day. And along the way, the Scottsdale Airport contributes over $182 million a year to the city's economy. The combined economic impact of the airport and the surrounding air park activity is estimated to be nearly $3 billion a year. And another interesting piece of Scottsdale's history would actually take place quietly during this very same time period. A little-known Chicago-based company, some 30 years old, had just changed its name to Motorola and would open its first plant near Scottsdale's western border in 1950. And within just a few years, the company would open its second plant in 1956 within Scottsdale. And I wonder how many folks at the time realized that this would begin Scottsdale's entrance into the industry of high tech. Now, when I hear the name Motorola, I think of a failed cell phone company that crashed and burned in the early 2000s after having owned the cell phone industry for decades. Just another example of an American institution being schooled by some young upstart. In this case, the young upstart would be Apple and their iPhone doing the schooling. In the following years, the company would split off, with the cell phone part working hard on making a comeback in the following years. But in 1950, clearly, Motorola had yet to become a cell phone company, but they were known for their achievements and advancements in the radio and communication industries. In fact, they had recently made a name for themselves with the development of their first commercially successful car radio in the 1930s, and had expanded into the television manufacturing space by the 1940s. The Galvin Manufacturing Corporation chose the name Motorola, declaring it to mean sound in motion, to emphasize their focus on not only car radios, but the communication tools of the future. The Arizona plants marked Motorola's entry into the semiconductor industry and was one of the first of its kind in the country. It was also just the first step in Motorola's strategy to diversify its product offerings and enter new markets. The research and development conducted in these plants would go on to revolutionize not only the semiconductor industry, but the development of all sorts of electronic advancements in the era. And apparently, all this was just before we made the decision as a nation to hand the entire industry over to China. Okay, that's just me being sarcastic, but I mean, that's kind of what we did, isn't it? Or wait, maybe we just let them take it. Anyways, as I'd learned, all this would be just the beginning for Motorola. From their new home in Scottsdale, they'd go on to play a crucial role in the space race during the 1960s and beyond. The Scottsdale plant played a critical role in the Apollo 11 mission, and Motorola's Government Electronics Division in Scottsdale designed and built the transponder that transmitted the famous words and images from the moon landing in 1969. The plant also worked on various defense and communication projects, further establishing Scottsdale as a hub for advanced technology. But probably one of the most notable of Motorola's contributions to the industry was the foundation that it built in Scottsdale, that brought many, many more from within the tech industry into the town and the community it fostered. And this is how Scottsdale would become known as a leader when it comes to being the home of startups. Now, sadly, all those achievements would come at a cost, when the Motorola plant would be leaked to groundwater contamination issues in the area in the early 1980s. Now, it appears that the federal government, the folks in Scottsdale, as well as Motorola, reacted fairly quickly to shut down contaminated water sources and begin remediation while adding alternative sources. Motorola itself, by the early 1990s, had invested over $30 million to the remediation efforts, including the new water treatment plant. Wow, Scottsdale! Just a little over 70 years ago, a community of 2,000 incorporated the town and took the first step towards what is today. And it's a crazy diverse place. Most any activity you can think up, there's likely a place to do it in Scottsdale, and pretty likely in or on a world-class facility. Just look at Westworld. It's also a place known for its heavy investment in its educational system and always has been. But it's also the place known as the West's most western town. Wow, that's almost a tongue twister. The West's most western town. A slogan first applied to the town way back in the 1940s. A slogan that stuck because of the town's ability to embrace its cowboy heritage and bring it and its horse culture into the 21st century. Now there's a lot more, I'm sure, just as there is in every spot we get ready to roll out of. Rolling out of Scottsdale would involve a few hugs and a whole bunch of thank yous and see you soons. Not even sure what direction we'll go this time. The only thing I know for sure is that the rest of that Phoenix metropolitan area was just over that way. So we'll go the other way. And I wonder what we'll learn there. Turns out, this thing called life comes with a lot of rules. Maybe it's time to break a few. Because you can. No, seriously. You can.